The night was tense in New York City. The heavy, overcast sky mirrored the mood of Emily Carter, a 26-year-old woman rushing through the wet streets after yet another frustrating day. Her hair was tied back in a messy bun, and her hands trembled from the cold as she clutched a folder filled with documents, the only hope of saving the small cafe she had inherited from her late mother. Fate seemed to mock her when, as she turned a corner, she was nearly run over by a sleek black sports car that screeched to a halt mere inches from her knees. From the driver's seat emerged a tall man, impeccably dressed in a tailored Italian suit. He was Henry Lancaster, a billionaire known not just for his staggering wealth but for his cold heart and arrogant demeanor. "Do you even watch where you're going?" he asked, his voice laced with disdain. "Maybe you should slow down in the rain." Emily shot back, standing her ground under his cutting gaze. Henry fell silent for a moment, surprised by her boldness, but said nothing more. He got back into his car and sped off, leaving her standing there, still shaking from the encounter. Little did Emily know that this chance meeting would change her life forever. 2 days later, Emily was summoned to the opulent headquarters of Lancaster Enterprises. Unsure why she was called but left without options, she went. In the office, she found Henry, gazing out over the city skyline with a glass of whiskey in hand. "Sit," he ordered, not even turning to look at her. She obeyed but kept her gaze steady. "I understand you're facing financial difficulties," Henry began. "I need something, and you're in a unique position to help me." "Where are you going with this?" Emily asked, her suspicion evident. Henry turned, his cold eyes locking onto hers. "I need a wife." The statement caught her off guard. He explained that to secure controlling interest in a rival company, he needed to present himself as a reformed man, committed and ready to settle down. But he made it clear, this was strictly a contract, with no love or affection involved. "There are plenty of benefits for you. I'll pay off your debts and fund your family's cafe. In exchange, you'll be my wife, but understand this, I will never love you." The words cut Emily like a knife. But with her cafe on the verge of closure and no alternatives in sight, she accepted. "Fine," she replied firmly, "but you should know I'm no one's puppet." The day of the wedding came faster than Emily could have prepared for. It was a whirlwind of arrangements, contracts, and terse instructions from Henry's legal team. Despite the grand setting of the ceremony, a private estate nestled in the Hamptons, it all felt mechanical, devoid of the warmth and joy weddings usually embodied. Emily's role was clear: play the devoted wife for the cameras and leave her emotions at the door. As she stood in the dressing room staring at herself in the mirror, Emily barely recognized the woman reflected back. Her ivory gown fit perfectly, but it felt more like a costume than something she would have chosen for herself. The hairdresser was finishing her curls, and the makeup artist gave her a final swipe of lipstick before stepping back to admire their work. "You look stunning," one of them said, smiling warmly. Emily forced a polite nod, but said nothing. Her stomach churned with a mix of nerves and dread. This wasn't a fairy tale wedding. It was a business deal. And the man waiting for her at the end of the aisle had made it painfully clear that this arrangement was purely transactional. Outside, Henry stood by the altar, his sharp black tuxedo immaculate. He exuded confidence, his expression as cold and detached as ever. The small crowd of investors, business partners, and a handful of media representatives watched him with curiosity. To them, this wedding was nothing more than a spectacle, an image rehabilitation stunt for a man infamous for his ruthless reputation. When the music began to play, signaling Emily's entrance, all eyes turned to her. She walked down the aisle slowly, clutching her bouquet tightly. Henry's gaze met hers, and for a fleeting moment, she thought she saw something human behind his icy exterior. But it was gone as quickly as it appeared. As she reached the altar, the officiant began the ceremony. The vows were spoken with mechanical precision. Emily's voice trembled slightly, but she pushed through, determined not to show weakness. Henry, in contrast, delivered his lines with an almost rehearsed indifference. "I, Henry Lancaster, take you, Emily Carter, to be my wife," he said, his voice calm and detached, "for better or worse in sickness and health, until this arrangement has served its purpose." A faint chuckle rippled through the crowd at the dry humor in his tone, but Emily's cheeks flushed with embarrassment. It was a reminder, if she needed one, that Henry saw this union as little more than a business deal. When the officiant declared them husband and wife, Henry leaned in to kiss her cheek, his lips barely brushing her skin. The gesture was so devoid of affection that it might as well have been a handshake. The reception was equally lifeless. While the guests mingled and celebrated, Emily sat at a table near the edge of the room, nursing a glass of champagne. She watched Henry as he moved through the crowd, charming investors and laughing at their jokes. He was a master of his environment, completely at ease in this world of power and wealth. "Enjoying yourself?" Henry's voice startled her. He had appeared at her side, holding his own glass of champagne. "It's everything I ever dreamed of," she replied dryly, not bothering to hide her sarcasm. He smirked, clearly amused. "Well, you'll have to get used to it. This is your life now." Emily's jaw tightened, but she didn't respond. She knew better than to argue. For now, she had to play her part and survive this cold, calculated world. That night, Emily moved into Henry's sprawling Manhattan penthouse. The space was as luxurious as it was impersonal. Marble floors, floor-to-ceiling windows, and an endless expanse of gray and white decor. Henry showed her to her room, a guest suite on the opposite end of the apartment from his own. "This will be yours," he said, his tone matter-of-fact. "I trust you'll be comfortable." Emily stared at him, her heart sinking further. Right, because a guest room is exactly what every bride dreams of. Henry raised an eyebrow, unamused. "This is an arrangement, Emily. Let's not pretend it's something it's not." As he walked away, Emily sat on the edge of the bed, staring at the pristine room around her. The walls seemed to close in, and for the first time that day, she let a single tear slip down her cheek. She didn't want to feel defeated. She had agreed to this deal to save her mother's legacy, and she wasn't about to let Henry Lancaster break her spirit. But as the city lights glittered outside her window, she couldn't help but wonder how long she could keep up the facade. The weeks following their wedding settled into an uneasy routine. Emily and Henry lived like strangers, their paths crossing only when absolutely necessary. In public, they played their roles flawlessly. Emily, the radiant new wife, and Henry, the reformed billionaire husband. Behind closed doors, their interactions were limited to curt exchanges and shared glances filled with unspoken tension. But something began to shift one late evening. Emily sat in the kitchen of the penthouse, a mug of tea warming her hands. The vast, sterile apartment was eerily silent, and the loneliness pressed down on her. She had spent the day revising the business plan for her cafe, determined to make it a success despite everything. However, her thoughts kept drifting back to Henry, his cold demeanor, his calculated movements. She couldn't understand how someone could be so impenetrable. The sound of footsteps broke her train of thought. Henry appeared in the doorway, his tie loosened, and the weight of a long day visible on his face. He paused when he saw her, as if surprised to find her still awake. "Couldn't sleep?" he asked, his tone neutral. Emily shrugged. "Something like that. You?" "Work," he replied simply. He crossed the room and poured himself a glass of water, his movements unusually unguarded. For the first time, he seemed less like the untouchable billionaire and more like a man carrying invisible burdens. Emily hesitated before speaking. "Why do you do it?" "Do what?" he asked, not turning to face her. "Work yourself to death. Run your life like a business transaction. Don't you ever want more than this?" Henry turned to her then, his piercing gaze locking onto hers. For a moment, she thought he might lash out, but instead, he let out a bitter laugh. "Want more?" he echoed. "People don't want me, Emily. They want what I can offer. Power, money, status, that's all they see." His words hit her harder than she expected. There was pain in his voice, buried beneath layers of indifference. It was the first glimpse of humanity she'd seen in him, and it stirred something inside her. "That's not true," she said softly. Henry's eyes narrowed. "Isn't it? Look around. Even you." He stopped himself, realizing the implication of his words. "Even me?" she pressed, her voice firmer now. "Is that what you think? That I'm just another person who wants something from you?" He didn't respond, but the silence between them was heavy with meaning. Emily stood, her frustration bubbling to the surface. "I don't know who hurt you or made you believe you're only worth what you can give to others," she said, her voice trembling. "But I'm not one of them, Henry." She left the room before he could reply, her heart pounding. For the first time since their arrangement began, she saw the cracks in Henry's armor. And for reasons she couldn't yet explain, she wanted to understand him. The next day, Henry found himself distracted. Emily's words lingered in his mind, challenging the walls he had built around himself. At work, he barked orders at his staff and signed deals with mechanical efficiency, but her voice echoed in his thoughts. That evening, as he reviewed some files in his home office, he heard the faint sound of piano music drifting through the penthouse. It was hesitant at first, as if the player was testing the keys, but soon the notes grew confident, filling the empty space with haunting beauty. Curious, he followed the sound to the living room. There, he found Emily seated at the grand piano, her fingers gliding over the keys. She played with her eyes closed, completely lost in the melody. Henry stood in the shadows, captivated. When the music stopped, Emily looked up and saw him. "I didn't know you played," he said, his voice softer than usual. "It was my mom's," she replied, her fingers resting lightly on the keys. "She used to play for me when I was little. After she passed, I taught myself." Henry nodded, his gaze lingering on her longer than he intended. "You're good," Emily blinked, surprised by the rare compliment. "Thanks." For a moment, they simply looked at each other, the distance between them shrinking. It was a fragile truce, an unspoken acknowledgement of the walls they both carried. But just as quickly, Henry straightened, his guarded expression returning. "Good night, Emily," he said abruptly before walking away. Later that night, as Emily lay in bed, she couldn't shake the image of Henry standing in the doorway, his eyes unguarded for the briefest of moments. She had agreed to this marriage to save her cafe. But now she wondered if there was more to this arrangement than she had bargained for. It had been 2 weeks since their late-night encounter in the kitchen and the unexpected piano interlude. Though their daily lives continued in quiet detachment, the air between them felt different. Charged with a tension neither could fully understand. One evening, Henry surprised Emily by announcing a charity gala they would need to attend as a couple. She rolled her eyes internally at his curt delivery, but said nothing. When the evening came, she found herself in the back seat of his limousine, wearing a stunning emerald gown his assistant had picked for her. The dress fit perfectly, accentuating her figure, but it felt like another costume she was forced to wear. "You look presentable," Henry said as they entered the ballroom. Emily shot him a glare. "Thank you, Your Majesty. I'll try not to embarrass you." He smirked at her sarcasm but said nothing. The gala was held in one of Manhattan's most opulent venues, a sprawling hall with glittering chandeliers and live orchestral music. Henry, as usual, moved through the crowd like a seasoned politician, shaking hands and exchanging pleasantries with potential business allies. Emily stayed close, smiling politely but feeling like a prop in his well-rehearsed performance. As the evening progressed, Emily grew restless. She stepped outside to the balcony for a moment of solitude, letting the cool night air wash over her. Below, the city stretched endlessly, its lights blinking like distant stars. "You're avoiding me?" Henry's voice came from behind her. Emily turned, startled. He leaned casually against the doorframe, a glass of champagne in his hand. "I thought I was giving you space to network," she replied, her tone light but defensive. Henry stepped closer, his eyes studying her. "You're different tonight." "What's that supposed to mean?" she asked, crossing her arms. "Usually you have some clever retort ready to put me in my place, but tonight, you're quiet." Emily exhaled, her gaze returning to the city below. "It's hard to be myself when I feel like I'm just playing a role." Henry frowned, her words cutting deeper than he expected. Before he could respond, the sound of the orchestra shifted, playing a romantic waltz that floated through the open doors. "Dance with me," he said suddenly, extending his hand. Emily blinked. "Are you serious?" "As serious as I ever am," he replied, a hint of a smile tugging at the corner of his lips. Against her better judgment, she took his hand. He led her back into the ballroom, where the other couples twirled gracefully under the shimmering chandeliers. Henry pulled her close, his hand firm against the small of her back as they began to move. "You're surprisingly good at this," Emily admitted, her voice tinged with surprise. "I've had practice," he said, his tone softer than usual. "It's expected in my world." For a moment, Emily allowed herself to relax, following his lead as they glided across the floor. She couldn't help but notice how his normally cold demeanor seemed to melt in the intimacy of the dance. His hand, warm and steady, sent a shiver down her spine. "You're full of surprises, Henry Lancaster," she said, looking up at him. "And you," he replied, his voice low, "are full of questions." Their eyes locked, and for the first time, neither of them looked away. The rest of the room faded as an unspoken connection passed between them. It was fragile, delicate but undeniable. Later that night, as the limo drove them home, Emily stared out the window, replaying the dance in her mind. Henry sat beside her, his expression unreadable, but his hand rested casually on the seat between them, closer to hers than usual. When they reached the penthouse, Henry hesitated at the door to his study. "Emily," he said, his voice stopping her as she headed toward her room. She turned, waiting. "Thank you for tonight," he said quietly. Emily smiled faintly, unsure of what to make of the moment. "Good night, Henry." "Good night," he replied, watching her disappear down the hall. Alone in his study, Henry poured himself a drink, his thoughts a whirlwind of confusion. Emily Carter was supposed to be a means to an end, a business arrangement, nothing more. But the way she had looked at him tonight, the way she fit so effortlessly in his arms on the dance floor, it stirred something he hadn't felt in years, something he wasn't ready to name. Meanwhile, in her room, Emily lay awake, staring at the ceiling. For all of Henry's flaws, she couldn't ignore the man she glimpsed tonight, the man hidden behind the walls he so carefully constructed. She told herself it didn't matter. This wasn't a real marriage. But her heart, traitorous and foolish, whispered otherwise. The morning after the gala, Emily woke with an unfamiliar sense of warmth. The memory of the dance lingered in her mind, the music, the way Henry's hand felt steady against her back, and the fleeting vulnerability in his eyes. But reality hit her like a cold shower. This was a business arrangement, not a fairy tale. Shaking the thought away, Emily headed to the kitchen. To her surprise, Henry was already there, standing by the island counter with a mug of coffee. His tie was undone, his sleeves rolled up, a rare sight that made him look almost approachable. "Good morning," he said, his tone unusually calm. "Morning," she replied cautiously, pouring herself a cup of coffee. For a few moments, the only sound was the hum of the city outside. It wasn't uncomfortable, but it wasn't exactly easy either. "About last night," Henry began, breaking the silence. Emily tensed. "Here it comes," she thought. "He's going to remind me this means nothing." "You looked happy," he continued, surprising her. "You should smile like that more often." Emily blinked, caught off guard. "That's probably the first nice thing you've said to me." "Don't get used to it," he said, though the corner of his mouth twitched into a faint smile. Emily couldn't help but laugh, the tension between them dissolving, even if just for a moment. It was strange. This man who had been nothing but cold and calculating was starting to feel human. Later that day, Emily decided to check on her cafe. Henry had fulfilled his promise, paying off the debts and financing renovations, but she hadn't been back since the deal began. When she arrived, the place felt like home again, the familiar aroma of freshly brewed coffee and the buzz of conversations filling the air. "Mrs. Lancaster," one of the baristas exclaimed. "It's so good to see you." Emily winced slightly at the title but smiled warmly. "Just Emily, please. How's everything going?" "Better than ever. The new equipment has been a lifesaver. Thank you for everything." Emily felt a pang of guilt. It wasn't really her doing, it was Henry's money. But as she walked through the cafe, chatting with the staff and regular customers, she felt a renewed sense of purpose. This place wasn't just a business, it was her mother's legacy, and she would fight to keep it alive. When Emily returned to the penthouse that evening, she found Henry in the living room, reviewing documents. He barely looked up as she entered. "Long day?" he asked, his voice almost casual. "I went to the cafe," she said, dropping her bag on the counter. "It's doing really well. I just wanted to thank you." He glanced at her then, his expression unreadable. "It's business." "No," she said, stepping closer. "It's more than that. You didn't have to help me, but you did. So thank you." Henry looked away, clearly uncomfortable with her gratitude. "Don't make a habit of it." Emily smiled, shaking her head. "Why do you do that?" "Do what?" "Push people away," she said, sitting down across from him. "Every time someone gets close, you put up a wall." Henry's jaw tightened. For a moment, she thought he wouldn't answer. But then he spoke, his voice quieter than usual. "Because walls keep you safe," he said. "If you don't let anyone in, they can't hurt you." Emily's chest tightened at his words. She saw the pain behind them, the wounds he tried so hard to hide. "Not everyone wants to hurt you, Henry." He looked at her then, his eyes searching hers as if trying to believe her. But before either of them could say more, his phone buzzed on the table, breaking the moment. He picked it up, his professional mask snapping back into place. "I have to take this," he said, standing. "Good night, Emily." "Good night," she replied, watching him walk away. Later that night, Emily found herself sitting at the piano again. She played softly, the notes filling the empty space around her. She wasn't sure why, but it brought her comfort, like her mother was still with her in some small way. As she finished the melody, she looked up to see Henry standing in the doorway, his expression unreadable. "Don't stop," he said, his voice low. Emily hesitated, then began to play again. This time, Henry crossed the room and sat on the edge of the piano bench beside her. The silence between them was thick with unspoken words, but it didn't feel awkward. It felt peaceful. "You're full of surprises," he said after a while. "So are you," she replied, her fingers never faltering on the keys. For the first time, Henry didn't argue. Instead, he stayed, listening to the music, letting his walls crack just a little more. The days that followed were unlike any Emily had experienced since moving into Henry's world. The walls between them, once insurmountable, were beginning to crumble in quiet, unexpected ways. Henry lingered at the piano when Emily played, and she noticed him pausing in conversations, his sharp retorts softening into something resembling curiosity or care. One evening, Henry came home earlier than usual, carrying an air of uncharacteristic excitement. Emily, sitting on the couch with a book, looked up as he walked in. "Don't tell me the mighty Henry Lancaster is taking a break from conquering the world," she teased. He smirked, loosening his tie. "Don't get used to it. I have something to show you." Curiosity piqued. Emily followed him as he gestured for her to grab a coat. Moments later, they were in his car, driving through the glowing streets of Manhattan. Henry didn't say where they were going, and Emily didn't press him. The tension between them was strangely exhilarating. When they arrived, Henry stopped in front of a boutique art gallery. The windows sparkled with fairy lights, and inside, a private exhibition was in full swing. Emily hesitated as Henry opened the car door for her, a gesture so rare it caught her off guard. "What is this?" she asked, stepping out. "A surprise," he said, his tone lighter than usual. The gallery was intimate, the walls adorned with stunning paintings and sculptures. But one piece stood out, a large canvas of a sunrise breaking through stormy clouds. The colors were vivid, almost alive, and Emily couldn't tear her eyes away. "It's beautiful," she whispered, feeling an unexpected lump in her throat. "It reminded me of you," Henry said quietly. Emily turned to him, stunned. "Of me?" He nodded, his gaze fixed on the painting. "You're like that sunrise, breaking through everything dark and chaotic. I didn't realize how much I needed that until now." For a moment, Emily didn't know what to say. The words were so raw, so un-Henry, that they left her breathless. She looked at him, searching for the cold, distant man she had married, but he wasn't there. Instead, she saw someone vulnerable, someone real. "Henry," she began, her voice soft. Before she could continue, he shook his head, his mask slipping back into place. "Don't read too much into it," he said quickly. "It's just a painting." Emily's heart sank a little, but she didn't push. She knew better than to try to break down his walls all at once. Later that night, as they drove back to the penthouse, the silence between them felt charged, as if they were both standing on the edge of something neither was ready to name. Emily stared out the window, her thoughts swirling. "Thank you," she said finally, breaking the silence. "For tonight." It meant a lot. Henry glanced at her, his expression unreadable. "You're welcome." When they arrived home, Emily hesitated at her bedroom door. She turned back to find Henry watching her, his hand resting on the edge of the hallway wall. "Good night, Henry," she said softly. "Good night, Emily," he replied, his voice warmer than it had ever been. But the universe had a way of testing fragile moments of peace. The next morning, Emily was startled awake by the sound of Henry's voice, sharp and angry. She rushed into the living room to find him on the phone, his expression dark. "What's going on?" she asked when he ended the call. Henry ran a hand through his hair, clearly agitated. An investor pulled out of a deal at the last minute. It could cost us millions. Emily frowned. Is there anything I can do to help? Henry looked at her, his irritation softening. You've done enough. This isn't your problem. But it's yours, she said, crossing her arms, and like it or not, we're in this together. Her words struck something in him. For a moment, he didn't respond. Then, without warning, he let out a short laugh. You're relentless, he said, shaking his head. Fine. There's a meeting tonight. If you want to help, come with me. Show them that I'm not the cold, heartless tyrant they think I am. Emily raised an eyebrow. You want me to play the doting wife? Henry's smirk returned. You're good at it. She rolled her eyes but couldn't hide the small smile tugging at her lips. Fine, but don't forget, this doting wife has claws. That evening, Emily found herself in yet another lavish event, this time a private dinner with key investors. Henry introduced her with unexpected warmth, his hand resting lightly on her back as they navigated the room. To her surprise, the evening went smoothly. Henry's confidence, combined with Emily's natural charm, seemed to disarm even the most skeptical attendees. At one point, as the group laughed at a story Emily told about her cafe, she glanced at Henry. He was watching her, a rare softness in his gaze. It was fleeting, but it sent a flutter through her chest. When the dinner ended, Henry escorted her out to the car. As they slid into the back seat, the tension between them was almost palpable. You were amazing tonight, he said quietly. Emily smiled. I had a good partner. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, without thinking, Henry reached for her hand. His touch was hesitant, almost unsure, but it was enough to make Emily's heart race. Emily, he began, his voice low. I don't know how to. But before he could finish, the car came to a sudden halt. The driver muttered an apology, but the moment was lost. Emily pulled her hand away, her pulse pounding in her ears. As they stepped out of the car, the city lights casting a glow around them, Emily couldn't help but wonder, was Henry Lancaster finally letting her in? Or was she simply getting lost in a world she couldn't control? The fragile progress between Emily and Henry hung like a delicate thread in the days that followed. They tiptoed around each other, as if both afraid of pulling too hard and snapping the bond that had begun to form. But fate had other plans, and their worlds were about to collide in a way neither could have anticipated. It started with a phone call. Emily was at her cafe, reviewing the month's earnings, when her phone buzzed on the counter. She glanced at the screen and froze. It was Henry's assistant, a call she rarely received unless it was urgent. Emily, I'm sorry to bother you, the assistant began, her voice tense. But Henry's been in an accident. The words hit like a punch to the stomach. What? Is he okay? Where is he? He's at Lenox Hill Hospital. He's stable, but they're running tests. He's been asking for you. Emily didn't waste a second. She grabbed her bag and ran out the door, her heart pounding as she hailed a cab. The ride to the hospital felt endless, her mind racing with worst-case scenarios. When she finally arrived, she was directed to a private room in the VIP wing. Henry was sitting up in bed, his left arm in a sling and a cut on his forehead. He looked pale, but otherwise unscathed. The relief that flooded through Emily was almost overwhelming. Henry, she breathed, rushing to his side. What happened? He smirked weakly, though it lacked his usual sharpness. A car ran a red light. My driver swerved to avoid it, and we hit a pole. Nothing dramatic. Nothing dramatic? She repeated, her voice rising. You're in a hospital bed, Henry? He raised an eyebrow, his lips curving into a faint smile. Are you worried about me, Mrs. Lancaster? Emily glared at him, but her anger quickly dissolved into something softer. She sank into the chair beside his bed, her hands trembling as she rested them on her lap. You scared me, she admitted quietly. Henry's smile faded, replaced by something more serious. I'm sorry. The sincerity in his voice took her by surprise. Before she could respond, the door opened, and a doctor entered, explaining Henry's injuries in clinical detail. Emily listened intently, her eyes flicking to Henry's every so often, as if to reassure herself he was truly okay. The next few days were a blur of hospital visits and recovery. Emily insisted on staying by Henry's side, though he protested at first. You don't have to babysit me, he grumbled one afternoon as she adjusted his pillows. I'm not babysitting, she shot back. I'm making sure you don't drive the nurses insane. Despite his protests, Emily's presence seemed to comfort him. She brought books from the penthouse, made him laugh with stories about her cafe, and on one occasion even snuck in his favorite bourbon, though she made sure he only had a sip. As the days passed, Henry began to notice things about Emily he hadn't allowed himself to before. The way her laughter filled the room like sunlight breaking through clouds. The way her determination softened into kindness when she thought no one was watching. The way she looked at him, not as the ruthless billionaire the world feared, but as a man she was slowly beginning to understand. One evening, as they sat in the quiet of his hospital room, Henry broke the silence. "You didn't have to do all this," he said, his voice low. "You could have stayed at the cafe, kept your distance." Emily looked at him, her brow furrowing. "And let you go through this alone? What kind of person would that make me?" Henry held her gaze, something unspoken passing between them. "A smart one," he said after a moment, though there was no edge in his tone. Emily shook her head, a small smile playing on her lips. "I guess I'm not as smart as you think." "No," he said softly. "You're better." The words hung in the air, heavy with meaning. For a moment, neither of them spoke. Then, almost hesitantly, Henry reached for her hand. His fingers brushed against hers, tentative but deliberate. Emily didn't pull away. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to let someone in." Emily's heart clenched at the vulnerability in his words. "Then let me show you," she said gently. Henry's eyes searched hers, as if looking for an answer to a question he couldn't articulate. Slowly, he nodded. The turning point between them wasn't dramatic, but it was significant. Henry began to let his walls down, little by little, and Emily met him halfway. Their interactions became warmer, their silences more comfortable. They weren't just playing their roles anymore. They were building something real. But as their bond deepened, so did the risks. Emily couldn't ignore the voice in the back of her mind, warning her that Henry could retreat into his defenses at any moment. And Henry couldn't shake the fear that allowing himself to care for her would only lead to heartbreak. The stakes were rising, and they both knew it. But for the first time, neither of them wanted to back down. The days turned into weeks, and what began as a cold, transactional arrangement was blossoming into something neither Emily nor Henry could deny. Their moments together, once marked by tension and distance, now carried an unspoken warmth. But as the walls between them crumbled, a storm brewed on the horizon, threatening to undo everything they had built. It started at a charity fundraiser. Henry, still recovering from his accident, insisted on attending, though Emily noticed the slight stiffness in his movements as he adjusted his tie in the mirror. "You don't have to go," she said, watching him from the doorway. "Appearances matter," he replied, his voice clipped. But when he turned to her, his expression softened. "And you're coming with me." Emily sighed, slipping on the diamond bracelet his assistant had delivered earlier. It was beautiful, but it felt like armor, another layer of pretense she wasn't sure she wanted to wear. Still, she followed him to the car, her hand brushing against his as he helped her inside. The fundraiser was as extravagant as she had expected, a sea of gowns, tuxedos, and champagne flutes glittering under crystal chandeliers. Emily moved through the room with practiced poise, her arm looped through Henry's as they greeted investors and partners. She noticed how his grip on her tightened slightly whenever someone looked at her for too long, a protective instinct he likely didn't even realize he had. But the night took a sharp turn when an unexpected figure entered the room. Victoria Monroe, Henry's ex-fiancée. Tall, blonde, and impossibly poised, she commanded attention the moment she stepped through the doors. Emily felt Henry tense beside her, his jaw tightening as Victoria approached. "Henry," Victoria said, her smile as polished as her diamond necklace. "It's been a while." "Victoria," he replied, his tone colder than usual. "And you must be Emily," Victoria said, turning her attention to her. Her eyes scanned Emily with barely concealed judgment, but her smile remained. "I've heard so much about you. All good things, I hope," Emily replied, her voice steady despite the knot tightening in her stomach. Victoria's smile widened, a calculated move that felt more like a challenge than a greeting. "Of course. Though I have to admit, I was surprised. Henry never struck me as the type to settle down." Emily forced a laugh, but before she could respond, Henry cut in. "Emily isn't anyone's type. he said sharply. "She's one of a kind." The words silenced Victoria, and Emily felt her cheeks flush. Henry's hand settled on the small of her back, grounding her as Victoria's expression faltered. But the moment was short-lived. Later that evening, as the limo carried them back to the penthouse, Emily stared out the window, the events of the night replaying in her mind. Henry hadn't said much after their encounter with Victoria, his silence heavy with unspoken tension. "Who was she to you?" Emily asked finally, breaking the quiet. Henry's gaze flicked to her, his expression unreadable. "No one that matters." Emily turned to face him, her brow furrowing. "She clearly mattered once. I deserve to know." Henry let out a heavy sigh, running a hand through his hair. Victoria was complicated. She wanted the version of me that fit into her world, the ruthless businessman, the perfect accessory to her ambitions. But when things got real, when I needed more than someone to parade around at galas, she wasn't there. Emily's heart ached at his words. She could hear the pain buried beneath them, the lingering scars of betrayal. "And now?" she asked softly. "Now," he said, his voice firm, "I have you." The words were simple, but they carried weight. Emily felt her breath catch, her heart pounding in her chest. But before she could respond, the car pulled to a stop in front of the penthouse. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. Henry's words echoed in her mind, stirring feelings she wasn't ready to confront. She made her way to the piano, her sanctuary, and began to play softly. The notes filled the empty space, calming her restless thoughts. She didn't hear Henry enter the room until he spoke. "Why do you always come here?" he asked, his voice low. Emily looked up, startled. He stood in the doorway, his figure silhouetted by the soft glow of the city lights behind him. "It reminds me of home," she said quietly. "Of my mom." Henry walked toward her, his movements uncharacteristically hesitant. "Play something for me." Emily hesitated, then nodded. She began to play a gentle melody, the music weaving between them like an unspoken conversation. When she finished, she looked up to find Henry sitting beside her on the bench, closer than she expected. "That was beautiful," he said, his voice softer than she'd ever heard it. "So are you," she whispered before she could stop herself. Henry's eyes widened slightly, but he didn't pull away. Instead, he reached out, his hand brushing against her cheek. The touch was light, hesitant, as if he were afraid she might disappear. "Emily," he murmured, his voice filled with something she couldn't quite name. "I don't deserve this. I don't deserve you." She placed her hand over his, her heart pounding. "Let me decide what you deserve." For a moment, the world seemed to stand still. Then, slowly, hesitantly, Henry leaned in, his lips brushing against hers. The kiss was tentative at first, but it deepened as the barriers between them dissolved completely. When they finally pulled apart, Emily saw something in Henry's eyes she hadn't seen before. Hope. "I don't know how to do this," he admitted, his voice trembling. "But I want to try. With you." Emily smiled, tears brimming in her eyes. "That's all I've ever wanted." The storm that had once threatened to tear them apart now seemed to push them closer together. But as they held each other in the quiet of the penthouse, both knew their journey was far from over. The challenges ahead would test them in ways they couldn't yet imagine. But for the first time, they were ready to face them, together. The days after their first kiss were a revelation for both Emily and Henry. Their lives, once defined by cold agreements and unspoken boundaries, were now filled with moments of genuine connection. Emily began to see the man behind the billion-dollar empire, one who laughed at her jokes, listened to her stories, and even tried, unsuccessfully, to learn a song on the piano. For Henry, it was as though a door had opened to a world he had long forgotten. Emily wasn't just his wife in name, she was his anchor, pulling him back to something real. But happiness, they quickly discovered, doesn't come without challenges. One morning, Emily was at her cafe, overseeing preparations for a new weekend brunch menu. The cafe was busier than ever, thanks to the upgrades Henry had funded. She had just finished a conversation with a supplier when her phone buzzed. It was a notification from a gossip site. Henry Lancaster's secret agenda, marriage or manipulation. Her stomach dropped as she clicked the link. The article speculated that Henry's marriage to Emily was nothing more than a calculated move to gain control of a rival company. Worse, it painted Emily as a clueless pawn, a simple girl taken in by a powerful man. The words stung more than she wanted to admit. That evening, when she confronted Henry about it, he was in his office, typing furiously on his laptop. "Henry," she said, holding her phone out, "have you seen this?" He glanced at the screen, his expression darkening. "Ignore it. These sites thrive on speculation. Henry, they're calling me a pawn. They're saying this marriage is a game." "Emily," his voice firm, "you know the truth. That's all that matters." "But do I?" She shot back, the words escaping before she could stop them. Henry froze, his eyes narrowing. "What's that supposed to mean?" Emily hesitated, her heart pounding. "When we started this, you said it was just an arrangement, that you'd never love me, and now, I don't know what we are." Henry stood, crossing the room to face her. "Do you think I would let you in like this if it wasn't real? Do you think I'd kiss you, hold you, care for you, if this was just a game?" Emily looked into his eyes, searching for the truth. She saw it there, raw and unguarded. But before she could respond, the door to the office swung open. It was Victoria. "Am I interrupting?" Victoria asked, her tone dripping with faux sweetness. She stepped inside without waiting for an invitation, her eyes flicking between Emily and Henry. "What are you doing here?" Henry demanded, his voice cold. "I came to warn you," Victoria said, ignoring his tone. "The board is restless. They think your marriage is a distraction. If you're not careful, you could lose everything." Emily felt the weight of Victoria's words like a stone in her chest. She turned to Henry, waiting for his response. "This marriage isn't their business," he said through gritted teeth. "And neither is yours." Victoria smirked, clearly unfazed. "We'll see how long that lasts." With that, she swept out of the room, leaving Emily and Henry in silence. That night, Emily couldn't sleep. She sat by the window in her bedroom, staring out at the city lights. When a soft knock sounded at her door, she turned to see Henry standing there, his expression unreadable. "Can I come in?" he asked. She nodded, and he stepped inside, closing the door behind him. He crossed the room and sat on the edge of her bed, his shoulders tense. "I know what you're thinking," he said quietly. "That Victoria's right, that this marriage is a liability." Emily shook her head, her voice trembling. "I'm not worried about the board, Henry. I'm worried about us." He reached for her hand, his touch hesitant. "Emily, I've made mistakes. I've hurt people, pushed them away because it was easier than letting them in. But with you, I don't want to make that mistake. I don't want to lose you." Her eyes filled with tears as she searched his face. "Then fight for us, Henry. Prove to me that this isn't just a transaction." Henry cupped her face in his hands, his voice filled with urgency. "It's not a transaction. You're not a pawn. You're my wife, Emily. My wife. And I'll do whatever it takes to protect what we've built." His words broke down the last of her defenses. She leaned into his touch, their foreheads resting together. In that moment, the noise of the world, the rumors, the doubts, the challenges, faded away. All that mattered was them. The next day, Henry made his intentions clear. He called a press conference to address the rumors head-on. Emily stood by his side as he faced the media, his voice calm and resolute. "This marriage is real," he said, his hand resting on Emily's. "Emily is not just my wife. She is my partner, my equal, and I will not tolerate anyone questioning her place in my life." The statement sent shockwaves through the room. As the cameras flashed, Emily looked up at Henry, her heart swelling with pride. For the first time, she felt truly seen, not as a pawn, but as someone who mattered. That evening, as they returned to the penthouse, Emily turned to Henry. "You didn't have to do that," she said softly. "Yes, I did," he replied, his voice steady. "Because you're worth it." The words were simple, but they carried the weight of everything they had been through. Emily reached for his hand, lacing her fingers with his. "Henry," she said, her voice trembling with emotion, "I love you." He froze, his eyes wide. For a moment, she thought he might retreat, but then he pulled her close, his arms wrapping around her as if he never wanted to let go. "I love you too," he whispered, his voice breaking. "I've been waiting my whole life to say that." As they stood together, the city lights casting a warm glow around them, Emily and Henry knew that their journey wasn't over. There would be challenges ahead, but for the first time they were ready to face them, together. The days following Henry's public declaration were nothing short of transformative. The air around them was different, lighter, freer, as if the weight of their arrangement had finally lifted. For the first time, their marriage wasn't about contracts or appearances. It was about them. One evening, Henry surprised Emily with a trip to his family's estate in the countryside. She hesitated at first, unsure of what to expect, but he insisted. "You've seen the worst of my world," he said, a playful smile tugging at his lips. "It's time I show you the best." When they arrived, Emily was speechless. The estate was sprawling, surrounded by fields of wildflowers and a crystal-clear lake that mirrored the sky. It was a world away from the cold steel of Manhattan, and for the first time, she felt like she could breathe. "This place is beautiful," she whispered as they stood by the lake. "It's the only place that ever felt like home," Henry admitted. "Until you." Emily turned to him, her heart swelling. "Henry," he smiled, brushing a strand of hair from her face. "Come on, there's something I want to show you." He led her to a small cottage on the edge of the estate. Inside, the space was cozy and warm, with a fire crackling in the hearth and shelves lined with books. "This was my mother's," Henry said, his voice soft. "She used to bring me here when the world got too overwhelming. It was her sanctuary." Emily ran her fingers along the worn spines of the books, her heart aching at the vulnerability in his voice. "Thank you for sharing this with me. I wanted you to see it," he said, stepping closer. "Because you're my sanctuary now." Tears welled in Emily's eyes as she looked at him. The man who had once been so closed off, so guarded, was now standing before her, completely open. She reached for his hand, her voice trembling. "You're mine too." That night, they sat by the fire, sharing stories and laughter. Henry told her about his childhood, the moments of joy and pain that had shaped him, while Emily shared memories of her mother and the cafe that had been her lifeline. They talked until the early hours of the morning, their connection deepening with every word. As the fire died down, Henry took Emily's hand, his expression serious. "I never thought I'd find this," he said quietly. "Not after everything I've been through. But you've changed me, Emily. You've made me want more." Emily smiled, her heart full. "You've given me more than I ever thought I could have. You've shown me that love is worth the risk." Henry pulled her close, his lips brushing against hers in a kiss that was as tender as it was passionate. In that moment, the past, with all its pain and mistakes, melted away, leaving only the promise of a future they would build together. The following morning, as they walked hand in hand through the fields, Henry stopped suddenly. Emily looked up at him, confused. "What is it?" she asked. "I've been meaning to ask you something," he said, pulling a small box from his pocket. Emily's breath caught as he opened it, revealing a simple but stunning diamond ring. "When we got married, it was for all the wrong reasons," he said, his voice steady. "But now, I want to do it right. Emily Carter, will you marry me? For real this time?" Tears streamed down her face as she nodded, her voice breaking. "Yes, 1,000 times, yes." Henry slipped the ring onto her finger, and they kissed, the wildflowers swaying around them as if nature itself was celebrating their love. Months later, they renewed their vows in an intimate ceremony at the estate, surrounded by friends and family. Emily wore a flowing gown of ivory lace, and Henry couldn't take his eyes off her as she walked down the aisle. As they stood together, exchanging vows written from the heart, there wasn't a dry eye in the room. Henry promised to cherish and protect her, to be the man she had believed in, even when he couldn't believe in himself. And Emily promised to stand by his side, through every storm and every sunrise. When they kissed, the room erupted in applause, but for Henry and Emily, the world had narrowed to just the two of them. As the sun set over the estate that evening, they danced beneath the stars, the music blending with the sounds of the countryside. Emily rested her head on Henry's chest, her heart full of gratitude for the journey that had brought them to this moment. "I love you," she whispered. "I love you more," Henry replied, his voice filled with emotion. "And I always will." Their love story, once born of necessity, had become something real, something unshakable. Together, they had faced the odds and emerged stronger, proving that sometimes the best things in life come from the most unexpected beginnings.